Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's special policy debate hosted by the Dean State Riverside School. My name is Alexandra Morales, and I am the Dean's Grants Ambassador. I will be serving as the moderator for today's event. Set with the backdrop of the current war in Ukraine, the topic for today's debate is whether economic sanctions, like those imposed by the international community on Russia, are too much of a good thing. Today, 2 UCR students will each debate this topic for the first hour of this webinar. We will also hold a brief audience Q&A directly after the debate for about 10 to 15 minutes, during which our audience members can pose questions to our student debaters. For our audience members joining via Zoom webinar, if you have any questions you would like to be posed during the audience Q&A session, please do not send them via chat, but instead please send them using the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Serving as our distinguished guest judge for today's debate is the founding dean of the UCR School of Public Policy, Anil Yolanwar. At the end of today's debate, the dean will give remarks and render a decision on which side won today's debate. Thank you so much, Dean, for taking time to be with us today. We're delighted you can join us. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce our student debaters. On the pro side is Catherine Ma. Catherine is a first-year public policy student. She is currently the Communications Director for the Roosevelt Network at UCR and one of the newest Dean's Brand Ambassadors for the UCR School of Public Policy. She aspires to get her master's in public health and attend medical school. On the con side is Isaac Anastasia. Isaac is a third-year public policy student. He is Alpha Epsilon Vice Brush Chairman and aspires to attain a Master's of Public Policy degree in the future. Please join me in welcoming our debaters. Now on to our debate. Our ambassador, Claudia Nunn, will be serving as timekeeper throughout the evening. The pro side will go first. Catherine, with 8 minutes. The floor is now yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Ma, and I will be arguing on the pro side. I want to thank you all for your time and excited to speak with you all about the overusage of economic sanctions. Before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about the main argument. I want to define a few key terms, the first being defining economic sanctions. This is coming straight from the Cambridge Dictionary, stating actions taken by a country or organization against the economy of another country, such as refusing to trade with it in order to force it to obey a law or set of rules. The next key term that I want to define is also from the Cambridge Dictionary, is the word overusage. This is to use something too frequently that over time becomes repetitive and may lose meaning. Now, as I get into my first main argument, I really wanted to talk about the effectiveness of economic sanctions. How effective really are they? There are many examples of how economic sanctions are not effective as people may think. I want to take my first example in looking into China, as we take a look from Dr. Jin Kai, who explains that Washington keeps adding new sanctions on China despite a distinct lack of results. Since July 2021, U.S. has imposed sanctions on intellectual properties like Chinese companies and military operations. But this still has not stopped their motives or any of their actions and their activities of gaining on U.S. intellectual properties. Instead, China has imposed more sanctions upon us, the U.S., and secondary sanctions. Next, I wanted to take a look at Russia, as since March 8th, the U.S. sanction on Russian oil has overnight affected the people of the United States. However, overnight has not affected Russia. Over these past 2 months, the people of the United States have faced high gas prices, but Russia has not changed its stance. I then want to also take a look at UK to Sudan. As Dr. O'Driscoll writes, sanctions have a damaging effect on income inequality and impact ordinary people more than the sanctioned country's leaders. Taking a look at this quote, we can really see and understand where the effectiveness of sanctions are being imposed while it's on the citizens and the people of the country rather than these leaders of the country. And then I want to take a look at this quote by Ms. Kimberly Ann Elliott, who is author of peer-reviewed journal of Economic Sanctions Reconsidered, which she states that since 1970, unilateral U.S. sanctions have achieved foreign policy goals in only 13% of the cases where they have been imposed. This means that right now it seems as though economic sanctions are the number one option. However, it does not justify since it is only 13%, which is less than a quarter of what is being used. And then now I want to take a look from The Economist, who write that on May 6, 2022, which is just recently, that Russia's economy is back on its feet. As though these economic sanctions are supposed to target the Russian economy, you can see that there is the dip right there between February and March that the ruble does deflate. However, now we take a look back in April and May where there are still hundreds of sanctions being imposed. It seems as though the ruble is back to normal and that Russia's economy is back on its feet as stated, and it's even getting higher. My second main argument is the idea of quality versus quantity. Since we're still talking about the Russian example, since February 22nd, 2022, there have been 104 sanctions and counting from 30 plus countries that have been imposed on Russia. These sanctions being imposed are really talking about the daily person's life, that there are so many that there are some insignificant ones, which include Finland's sanction on Russian transit that only will be hurting the people of Russia and of Finland who are trying to get back and forth. With this many sanctions, it's really hard to really talk about the small and look at the insignificant ones, as it does not affect Russia's governing bodies, but rather it's hurting the people of the country. It's hurting the people here and in Russia, rather than harming and doing what it is supposed to be doing as on Russian governing bodies. Now I want to take a look at argument 3. As we're looking at the long-term effects, it seems as though people have not really thought long-term as when they're imposing these economic sanctions. As we take a look at Dr. Taisha Marcus, they explain the sanctions may have had an effect to date, but may have only have meaningful consequences in the longer term. This is the idea that right now there may be a band-aid solution to what is happening, but in the long-term effect that economic sanctions are not being useful for those people in the country, of governing bodies, and kind of anyone in between. I also want to take another look at another quote by Dr. Phil Kuroshia, which explains that sanctions alone are unlikely to achieve desired results if the aims are large or time is short. So again, this kind of does reiterate the idea that it's not to say that sanctions are not beneficial in certain cases, but we must really have the thought and idea of what sanctions are so that we're not creating hundreds of sanctions imposed and making them overused so that it's doing more harm than it is doing good. These are my main arguments for why economic sanctions are being overused and how we can take a look at their effectiveness, the quality versus quantity, and how in the long-term effect, overusing sanctions are creating a harmful effect on anyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Prosai. At this point, I will now give 5 minutes to the Consci to pose questions to the Prosai. Isaac, you may begin asking the question.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So, Catherine, I know you kind of went into it, but could you just repeat, what do you think the long-term effects of economic sanctions are?
Yeah, so the long-term effects affect the citizens of the country and those involved from the middle class to lower class citizens, and they are harming them, whether that just be from like gas prices or different ways that they're hurting their economy, and in the long-term run, as well as like lifting economic sanctions that also does harm.
Okay, thank you. And how effective do you think economic sanctions are when multiple countries are involved?
Yes, so we can take a look at the idea of quality over quantity, that there's these 30 plus countries that have been imposing sanctions on just the Russian example alone. and how it seems as though Russia still has not moved its stance, yet there are over hundreds of sanctions, and it seems this idea is being overused, and therefore there is less, it's doing less than it is what harm.
Do economic sanctions prevent deadly conflict?
We can say that it is currently the #1 option to prevent war. However, it seems that number, that 13%, it is not really high enough, or it's less than 0.25% of the time that these economic sanctions are being used, that it is even being effective.
And what would really happen if we remove sanctions completely?
Yeah, so I'm not saying the idea that economic sanctions are not a good thing. However, it's the idea that they're not beneficial in every single case. And having these hundreds of sanctions being imposed and overusing them are really harming the people rather than these governing bodies and changing action.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you both. Now on to the concept presentation. Isaac, you may now present your case. Just like with the pro side, you have 8 minutes starting now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So just to begin, I want to go over a few things Catherine discussed in her case presentation. She talked about unilateral sanctions, that being one country imposing the sanction. But it's important to talk about multilateral sanctions as well. This is when multiple countries, like for example in Russia, Ukraine, European countries as well as American countries are putting economic sanctions onto Russia. And this number is a little different than 13%. So I just wanted to go over that really quick. So to go over what we see now, economic sanctions have 4 main pillars. They are meant to deter, to enforce, to punish a country, and as well as to rehabilitate the country. In the case of Russia, Ukraine, Putin was unprepared for the vast scale of multilateral economic sanctions. While many of these sanctions happened after the invasion, current sanctions may serve future deterrence. For example, Putin may pull back from countries that are not a part of NATO due to these multilateral economic sanctions. Therefore, by pull out of places like Moldova, Finland, and Sweden. Next is enforcing. So these economic sanctions enforce, or the way these economic sanctions are enforced is through powerful and sophisticated agencies that are closing these loopholes. And by loopholes, I mean things like smuggling. When sanctions are put onto exports or imports, well, they can easily just smuggle things across the border. However, institutions such as the CIA, the Customs and Border Protection, Office of Foreign Assets and Control, these institutions deter these loopholes and close the gap. And of course, economic sanctions are a non-violent punishment, and it's when countries aren't humanitarian, then there needs to be, of course, punishment. And Catherine talked about a broad sweep of economic sanctions, and it's important to not just hurt those that are on the top, but as a whole, because without the masses, with the masses feeling it, they will see, we can push them in the right direction with economic sanctions. And according to the Pearson Institute for International Relations, the economic hardship now inflicted on Russia ranks among the brutal episodes of modern times, far greater than the mild punishment inflicted for the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So it's important that economic sanctions are vital and they are putting on an impact, right? Economic sanctions are not mild. They're like in recent days, economic sanctions are seen to have results and to have an impact. And when we look at rehabilitation, deterrence and rehabilitation are the twin goals in economic sanctions. And intervention by another country, and the one that's enacting the sanctions, can lead to a ceasefire due to running out of war materials, right? And so when we get to that point, we can then push them in the right direction and say, okay, like we live in a global, we're pretty globalized, right? We want, humanitarian values to be, seen in other countries, right? And economic sanctions, to wrap up, economic sanctions are a liberal concept because it encourages cooperation. When countries violate global humanitarian values, economic sanctions starve these countries and curb this issue, and curb this issue until their values are aligned with global communities.
Thank you, Isaac. At this point, I will now give 5 minutes to the pro side to pose a question to the con side. Catherine, you may begin asking questions.
Okay, you explained how food is not ready for economic sanctions. However, you can see now on the economist chart that it seems like though their economy has bounced back. So why would you say that their economy is back to normal and that economic sanctions are being useful?
I would say they're vital because, as we've seen, they can curb these. So they're vital in Russia because, like, the entire mass is feeling it. Like, I'm sure we might have seen something where citizens are not really understanding the greater picture. So when economic sanctions are put onto the citizens, then they can see that, okay, like, we're feeling it, we want our leaders to.
So I guess talking about like citizens, so do you believe like harming the lower and middle class citizens of a country will help like change the governing body's stance?
No, I think economic sanctions aren't meant to harm citizens, but they're meant to realign the values of a country that's violating humanitarian globalist values and, make them positive rather than.
So then would you say, so recently it seems as though Russia has imposed a sanction on Finland's natural gases. So would you say that's a good thing, an economic sanction, as it is harming the citizens directly that way?
If economic sanctions are going to, make a country like it's the reason economic sanctions are in place is because without them, right, then what's the other option? Then it may end up leading to something that's violent, something that's not, that's going to have more citizen casualties, right? So economic sanctions in that way, they provide a lower level of like economic sanctions push the citizens into a better direction.
And I guess like when has these large number of economic sanctions worked, as you talked about the idea of having multiple countries impose sanctions on?
Sure. So your question was how these economic sanctions succeeded?
Yeah, like when has having large number of economic sanctions really succeeded?
So economic sanctions have succeeded before. As we can see, if we look at, so according to this Harvard article, economic sanctions are the most plausible alternative because next to force, they're the strongest available policy instrument. And in addition to that, with them being successful and vital, so, right, the sanctions are vital because they can push a country to see like global values and to instead of them hurting their citizens, make that change.
Okay, and I guess we work the question, how is it that when there's large numbers of economic sanctions, how does that really affect the country versus having like one large country impose a sanction? How is it that when there's like hundreds of them currently, like right now with the Russian example, how is that more effective?
So your question is how are multiple sanctions effective?
Having like large number, like these hundreds of numbers of sanctions, how is that helpful to these governing bodies versus like the people?
Because like governing bodies impose these sanctions in more than just one, because if we were to just put one across, right, then they may be able to bounce back from that, the countries that are getting sanctioned. So we have to put multiple sanctions on countries in order to better promote positive agenda.
Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you both. At this time, we will now move on rebuttal speech. This will be the prospect's opportunity to refute the opposing side. Catherine, you have 7 minutes, starting now.
Okay, so now I'll be talking about my opponent's points and kind of arguing on why their certain arguments are incorrect. So I wanted to talk about the idea of, he explained humanitarian values. So he said that economic sanctions help align these values and have humanitarian values. But it's the idea that I think these economic sanctions are actually harming the people more than doing good. And it's the idea that since if we want to really help the citizens of a country, that it's not the idea of targeting them, and targeting these lower and middle class citizens really is doing more harm than any good for them, because it seems as though governing bodies do not change their stance, especially when things are harming like lower and middle class citizens. I also wanted to talk about the idea of punishment, and I really think that also goes in the idea of turning into war, and punishment can really harm these different entities, because if we are only trying to punish certain places and certain entities, then I think the idea of looking at the long-term effect of how will they combat what is happening, or will there just be more sanctions going back and forth and everything will still be moving at a standstill. And then I also wanted to talk about the idea of deterrence, as though it seems as though as we take a look at the Russian example, it's really not deterring any forces of what's happening right now in Russia, that people are still going back and forth, that these sanctions are still being imposed, but nothing is really moving. So everything is still at a standstill, and people are not these governing bodies in Russia are really not changing their stance. And the idea of enforcement, he explained, Isaac talked about enforcement of these economic sanctions. I think I really wanted to talk about as well of how economic sanctions is not just when they're imposed that hurt the citizens, it's also when they are lifted that can harm the citizens. Because in any way there is more harm that can be doing than good. And I also just want to defend my case and kind of reiterate the idea that the effectiveness of these sanctions are really harming the citizens rather than these governing bodies, and it's really doing more harm than good. And having these hundreds of sanctions from 30 plus countries, specifically from Russia, our example here, it seems as though it is not doing any good, but it's creating a damaging effect on the income inequality and impacting the ordinary people and citizens, like our gas prices currently. And then I also want to reiterate the idea of having quality over quantity. As Isaac has explained, having sanctions is beneficial, and I do agree that sanctions can be beneficial. But having these hundreds of sanctions being overused really is not helping the country, but rather creating damaging effects and creating these small insignificant ones that only can harm the people rather than having an effect on these governing bodies. And then also I wanted to talk about the idea of looking at the long-term effect and really defending the idea that in the long run, behavior is not being changed. It's creating a band-aid solution for right now, and that there are only meaningful consequences in the longer term, as Dr. Taisha Marcus explains. So all in all, this is to say that sanctions are not beneficial in certain cases, but we really must have the thought that sanctions are not, we cannot be creating hundreds of them because they are becoming overused and losing their meaning. Thank
you, Catherine. Now I would like to give the con side an opportunity to give their rebuttal speech. Isaac, you have 7 minutes, starting now.
Thank you. So I want to get into the crux of Catherine's argument. Catherine is saying that citizens are harmed, the normal everyday citizens are harmed and governments are not. And economic sanctions aren't a cluster bomb that hits everyone and anyone. Economic sanctions can be targeted. They aren't, military rolling in and harming citizens. Economic sanctions can be targeted to these government, these government movers, these government actors. And another part is, so sanctions are not always harming necessarily, and economic sanctions can be used during peacetime. Economic sanctions do not have to be used during just war. They can be used during peacetime when, they're not meant to harm, but meant to instead realign. Sanctions can also come in waves. They're not a big slap in the face to a country, right? These sanctions can start at the government level and move down once the severity of the issue is examined. And another piece I want to look at is, so I'm talking about the creation of economic sanctions. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson is on record saying something more tremendous than war. The threat was an absolute isolation. That brings a nation to its senses, just as suffocation removes from the individual all inclinations to fight. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. That it was a quote he went on record saying, and this was during the creation of economic sanctions. And I think what he was trying to get across to the League of Nations was he did not want war. This was just after World War I, and he wanted something to deter violent force without using, without fighting fire with fire. So, like I said, just to reiterate, economic sanctions can be targeted. They don't have to just target citizens or citizens at all. And, they can be implemented during peace times when war is not happening. And they can also come in waves, in slow, calculated waves.
Thank you, Isaac. We will now move on to 5 minutes of open questions. Both teams now have the opportunity to take turns asking questions.
I can go first then. I was just wondering, who do you think is affected the most by the sanctions?
Well, it depends who they're targeted to. Like I said, they're not, just targeted to one group. They can be targeted. So I think it depends what sort of economic sanction is being implemented.
So would you say that it does definitely harm citizens then?
I would say if that's the target for an economic sanction, if that's the intended target, not if it's like a sanction that's going towards some government official, then that economic sanction would inadvertently harm the citizen. So you were saying that citizens are harming government is not. Do you think economic sanctions never harm governments? But they only harm citizens?
I think economic sanctions are definitely beneficial in certain cases, but it's the idea of overusing them and having these hundreds of sanctions imposed really can do more harm than good and really does target the citizens more than these governing bodies, as the governing bodies don't really move or change their stance, but rather these sanctions are really just more hurting the ordinary people. You talked about targeting. So I was wondering, when have they really been targeted to the government and then been successful with hundreds or lots of sanctions?
So the United States government actually targeted Iraq, and this wasn't a target on citizens, but it was targeted towards like the people who were manufacturing like weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And by curbing their supply line, they were able to stop this supply of mass.
Or I guess a follow up, when has it been that like multiple countries or multiple sanctions been imposed? When has that been successful?
Well, I would say, in the Russia-Ukraine, multiple sanctions, like different countries sanctioning Russia. There was a heavy hit that Russia had taken. And this is when it had succeeded, like at that point. At the point where, when things started ramping up and the United States and European countries were imposing these sanctions on Russia. So economic sanctions, I think, are a reminder that like we need each other, right? A reminder that different countries kind of rely on each other. So what do you think if a sanction, if we cut off a vital supply of a country that's violating humanitarian values and committing counter-terrorist crimes to their citizens, do you think that we should rather than sanctioning them from, say, a vital supply of computer chips, or should we instead consider another like more violent option, right? Like,
I would say that we definitely need to consider economic sanctions, as though right now it seems as though that's the #1 option people have been able to use. But it's the idea that if we continue to use these hundreds of sanctions and are really sanctioning on such small and insignificant things like railways and things like that, then it's really doing more harm to the people than anything else.
so railways, you said, were an insignificant thing to put a sanction on. When railways are sanctioned, say in Russia is the backbone of their supply line are railroads. So when a country such as Russia that's at war right now, shouldn't we cut them off with the route at the supply line at the railroad?
I think the railroads really are just for citizens. As I was taking a look, it was more like a subway system, so it was definitely more just for the citizens going back and forth. So that's definitely just harming the citizens that are trying to go back and forth and kind of do anything back and forth. I guess we talked about peacetime, so I was wondering, when have sanctions been used during peacetime?
Sanctions are used when there are economic hardships, not necessarily when we're going to war. So if countries are using for humanitarian aid or not at war, then that's when.
Thank you both. First side, you have 4 minutes to get concluding remarks.
For my conclusion, I would really like to talk about why the con points were invalid and why I have won this debate, or the pro side has won this debate, because I believe my side of the argument really talks about the effectiveness of economic sanctions, the idea of quality of economic sanctions, and the long-term effect from these economic sanctions. Taking a look again, I just really want to reiterate the idea of, if we really do value humanitarian values, that we would be making sure that citizens of our country are being taken care of, and instead that these economic sanctions aren't harming them, and that we're not creating hundreds of these insignificant ones to only harm the people and not harming government bodies. And I really just wanted to also talk about the idea of having sanctions during peacetime. That really seems as though it is creating more punishment for these governing bodies, and thus again kind of harming or creating consequences for the long-term effect, and only creating band-aid solutions for right now. And I really just want to talk about, again, like the 13% effectiveness of these economic sanctions, that if we continue to impose hundreds of them onto these different entities, that it seems this effectiveness is less than a quarter of the time, and people really need to really look into different solutions and how can we be attacking with different options. And I really believe and want to talk about the side of the argument that economic sanctions can be beneficial, but in the long-term effect, it seems as though the consequences that are being created for all these citizens, it is really harming them, doing more harm than any good, and it's not really receiving this desired result of harming the government and harming and changing actions for these people. Thus, I believe that the pro side has won, because the idea that overusage of sanctions are true, that economic sanctions are being overused in many countries from today and from 1970 that has been stated before. And they really do, they need to be targeted more, and they can't be just imposing hundreds of sanctions and counting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Conside, you have 4 minutes to give concluding remarks.
So just to reiterate some points, I know I discussed how economic sanctions have been a solution for the Iraqi military example. So in a Harvard article, economic pain has slowed the rebuilding of the Iraqi military, right? So economic sanctions helped compel Iraq to comply with UN efforts, with global national efforts, and to prevent it from acquiring these weapons. And it also contributed to Iraq's decision to recognize Kuwait. So, economic sanctions have their economic sanctions can be very vital, and they are used in this widespread manner, because we we sometimes will come up with a solution for a country problem. And the country will find it in themselves to change and to be, align with global values. And like I said, in the past, these economic sanctions are not something that are just thrown around, right? We do have government institutions to make sure that these loopholes, right, that can be gone through don't happen, right? So different government agencies are making sure that economic institutions are going to be implemented like the right way and implemented and unimplemented, like taken out smoothly. And then back to what where economic institutions came from, right? This was right after World War I, and we did not want to go to another war. So we wanted something that we could do from our home country and not break out into another war. And this was economic sanctions. And I'm sure many of you have heard the term mutually assured destruction. Well, we do have a mutually assured economic destruction. And this is a concept, whereas if we go to economic sanction war with a country, it's assured that we're not going to sanction each other to death, right? And so, thank you all. That was my-
Isaac, and thank you to our students for a great debate. From here, we're going to transition into an audience Q&A. You may pose your questions to either side. For our Zoom webinar audience, please submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and so to the chat box. So our first question is from Zoom webinar, and Yvette asks, these economic sanctions don't only hurt Russia, but a lot of other Eastern European countries that depend on Russian oil. How does this align with humanitarian values?
When a country is humanitarian atrocities, humanitarian negatives, then it's important to economically hinder a country to better see, realign their values.
Our next question will be from my fellow ambassador, Camilla.
Any of you can answer this question, but it's mostly directed towards Catherine. I know you were emphasizing not the overuses of economic sanctions, but did you have any other alternative suggestions instead of having the overuse of it, like overuse of economic sanctions, like something else in place of economic sanctions? So I guess deter countries from,
Yeah. So I feel like right now that is our number one option, economic sanctions before going to war. And I think it's really the idea of making sure that we're not overusing them, because if we are to make sure that each economic sanction that is being imposed on these different entities are really being accounted for, and that there aren't long-term consequences, or they're not just insignificant ones that are being created, I think then economic sanction can really have a push to somewhere. But right now, with having hundreds of imposed ones, then it does not create this outcome.
Question.
I'm not too sure exactly which side it could be more relevant. I think it could go both ways, but one of the examples that I know both of the speakers talked about a lot was Russia sanctions. And Russia is a unique country and economy where ordinary citizens are actually, well, not ordinary, but they actually control a lot of the economy, right? Oligarchs, they are not necessarily in government seats, even though a lot of them are. So I was wondering how, maybe what the best targeting of sanctions could be when it's not, strictly speaking, only applying to parliament members, but also just ordinary citizens who maybe used to have government connections or mafia relations. How are we gonna, stop sanctions from attacking ordinary citizens? But most of the people that are actually going to contribute change in the Russian economy are now simply citizens.
Kind of answer that. In doing some of my research, I remember one of the first economic sanctions were cutting we're paper money, we're getting like upfront money. So things like, I remember seeing things like boats and houses were essentially out of the control of these like oligarchs. That was something I read. I don't know, Catherine, anything you want to say?
Yeah, so I think with this whole Russian scenario right now, from what I heard before they cut off media from there, that actually the people and the citizens of Russia were actually kind of trying to protest against the government of what their actions and things like that. So it does kind of show that their citizens do have a say in things like that. But it seems as though these economic sanctions that have been on them has not really changed their actions per se.
What I know is that it's not actually. But a lot of things that and as reasons why they and when we talk about Ukraine, US obviously have obviously they don't want to go to opposite of the political spectrum against each other. So they use like economic sanctions not as a way to stop Russia, but actually a way to buy more time for the Ukrainian people to fight their questions. So it's when you put it like that, economic sanction is actually a very effective way in this specific environment or time. It's not used to be active sanctions the whole nation to stop invading Ukraine, but rather by take some time to fight themselves. So if you put it in that perspective, I think economic sanction is very effective.
Yeah, I think I would add on to that. I would just like to reiterate that economic sanctions are beneficial in certain cases, like how you were explaining, but this idea of overusing them, it kind of loses its meaning and that people are being harmed in the process instead of doing good. I would like to say, yeah, that economic sanctions are being overused. Yes.
I think to add something to that, I think maybe what the result is kind of saying is economic sanctions aren't black and white. They either succeed or they fail. They're a deterrent. And I think that might be what the audience member was doing. Is that sort of, yeah, so to clarify, that's what I got.
So I have a question, and you can both maybe answer this or give your thoughts on it. But and we kind of started talking about this, but you both talk a lot about the Russia scenario. But what are your thoughts on in the context of protecting the Ukrainian people, right? Because this is a major part of the conversation. So could you both maybe expand on your thoughts on do the sanctions that we've imposed have they been effective in protecting the Ukrainian people? So what are your thoughts on that in that context?
I can start then. I would say that if we really want to help the people of Ukraine, it's the idea that we're not harming them anymore, and that we really want to help the citizens of Ukraine, help the citizens of our allies and everything like that, and that economic sanctions should only be used to really help the people. And during this time, I think it's really vital that we use economic sanctions forcefully instead of just imposing hundreds of them.
So to sort of add on, or to say my point of view, we kind of got into it with an audience question, but economic sanctions sort of do buy the Ukrainian people time. And I think that is how the Ukrainian people are protected by economic sanctions. It's this sort of concept of buying them time and, you know, things like cutting off their supply lines, right? Things like their oil, for example. If the Russians are not succeeding economically, it's harder for them to succeed militarily and, you know, harm Ukrainian citizens.
Yes, so to add on to that a little bit more, it seems as though Russia's economy is back on its feet, though, as like the economist had stated earlier. So I don't know, like how imposing more and more sanctions are really helping the war against them.
I have a question. So Catherine, earlier you talked about statistically that you looked at, you saw that 13% of imposed sanctions were deemed
successful in working, quoted, you said less than a quarter of these economic sanctions are actually effective in deterrence. I'd like to know where you got that statistic and specifically more numbers like around that. In addition, if Isaac, if you could provide any numbers that support your side as well, showing that economic sanctions do prove themselves successful. We hear a lot of discourse surrounding that, but I'd like to know more data if possible. If you have that.
I can talk a little bit about the author as this is coming straight from her peer-reviewed journal called Economic Sanctions Reconsidered, and she's a research associate. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Ann Elliott, and throughout her paper, she's really talking about like the impacts of economic sanctions and kind of the idea of how since 1970 that it's only been 13%, and then I can pull up more.
That's perfect. Yeah, that was the majority of my question, where that 13% stemmed from, just, as it was tied loosely, just where that information came from.
Yeah, so a lot of my data came from, I'm sure you heard me mention a Harvard article. This is an article titled "Using Economic Sanctions to Prevent Deadly Conflict." The author is Elizabeth S. Rogers. She's a former associate and as an international security worker from 2005 to 2010. And this article is where I drew a lot of my data on, how effective they are, where they've been effective, and deterred these points.
So thank you guys both for your presentation, first of all. I kind of got a better understanding of how too much of something can be bad. But I was just curious, and maybe both of you guys can answer this question in your research. Was there some sort of lesser economic alternative that doesn't necessarily mean violence or stepping into more grounds that you can use as maybe an alternative to economic sanctions, so that you don't end up overusing them or that too many nations don't end up with alternatives that might come back?
Yeah, I can. So economic sanctions could be like something that's not a wide like blanket sanction. Could be a targeted one towards like military, for example. During war times, if a country's supplying, if a country's supplying, say Russia, for example, with guns and weapons, then it's vital if a sanction were to target, a lesser sanction that targets not citizens but military personnel, so like weapons, things like that.
Okay, thanks for that as well. There's also an idea of secondary sanctions. So Dow Jones explains it as imposing penalties on persons and organizations not subject to the sanctioning country's legal jurisdiction. So some of these like private parties can also take.
You just mentioned secondary sanctions. Can you go a little bit more into that? How would you say, like, is it beneficial or is it more religious thing?
Yeah, so I was doing a little bit of research about that. I was mostly talking economic sanctions, but secondary sanctions really are like penalties for violating. This idea of creating penalties on persons, organizations, or entities yet again, and harming them in their sanctioned countries' jurisdiction. So it's not directly those governing bodies or even the citizens, but it's rather these private entities.
Sorry, I just have one more follow-up on this. The secondary sanction. So would you say that that's like a different type of economic sanction that could be implemented for to hurt maybe major corporations inside of the nation, or is it more targeted towards civilians?
It's mostly country-based sanctions, as I can see right now. It depends on the country and those who are involved and who are governmental organizations they want to have.
Catherine, I know you talked about like harmful long term and like you're talking about gas prices like as an example. Do you have any other examples of like the long term effects, like how it impacts citizens specifically?
stores or anything that I believe there are kind of many examples, like even if we take the China example again, that really sanctions can also be on these intellectual properties.
When you say like, when you limit them, do you mean like after the certain amount of period it's been implemented?
Yeah, so like when like the country might feel as though like if this is not doing anything, so they just lift it or anything kind of.
Thank you for your questions. I think this concludes our Q&A. Now we move on to the final segment this evening. I am so honored to bring up our distinguished guest judge, Dr. Neil Bialalkar, founding dean of the UCR School of Public Policy, to give remarks, pick winners, and provide feedback for student leaders. Dean, word is yours.
Thank you, Alex, for your excellent moderation of the debate. And this is, I never imagined that my task will be as difficult as it is going to be now, because I found both the teams making very convincing arguments. And I thought I was convinced by something that Catherine said, and then when I heard Isaac's response, I said, oh, okay, that makes sense too. And so it was difficult to for me to decide who should be the winner. At the end of the day, I want to emphasize that despite whom I select as the winner of this evening's debate, both teams did very well. You have done your research, your homework, you presented your arguments very cogently, and those arguments were well founded. So I commend both of you for being great debaters. That said, there were some things that I think both of you could have brought up, which would have strengthened some of your arguments. And I'll just point out some of these points in the spirit of, not in the spirit of criticizing what you did, but in terms of saying, well, you could have strengthened it by referring to this point. And sometimes it's difficult to think about all of these other points off the cuff. But here I go, and I've taken some notes, so I want to make sure I sort of cover all of them. So when Catherine talked about how economic sanctions are sometimes of very limited use, you could have cited two examples, which, to my knowledge, are the two best examples which would strengthen our case. The United States has imposed sanctions of one sort or another against Cuba for God knows how many years, 60, 70 years. And the purpose of those sanctions was to bring down the Castro regime. Did that happen? No, it didn't happen. And so there you could sort of have said, my case is made. Okay. Cuba. Iran. Iran is another country that we have had sanctions against for close to 40, 50 years. And has that deterred some, has that sort of created regime change in Iran? No. And so that's a point I think you could have brought up. Those are good examples you might have alluded to. But I really like the general point that you made, that you were not really against sanctions per se, economic sanctions. You were just arguing that they should be limited in scope, and you should sort of impose hundreds and hundreds of sanctions. In order to be effective, they have to be limited in scope, limited in number, and target specific actors. So that was a good one argument, and I think that's a very important point. I also really like the point that Isaac brought up, which were got 4 points about the deterrence, enforcement, punishment, and rehabilitation, right? Now, deterrence is sort of a very important point, and you could have strengthened your case by telling Catherine that, look, sometimes it's difficult, since she was asking you at some point, well, give me an example of a context where lots of economic sanctions have worked. And you could have said, well, the beauty of economic sanctions is that they deter something from happening. So you never see the event that might have occurred but was prevented, right? So in the case of the sanctions against Russia, okay, we see Russia sort of continuing to fight against Ukraine, and we are now in month 3 of the war. There seems to be no end in sight. But maybe the sanctions deterred Russia from thinking about future aggressive invasions of other countries, such as Moldova or Estonia or Poland or whatever have you. Now, the fact that we don't have that, obviously you don't have that fact to show. And so that goes back to the question that I think, was it Camilla or who asked that question about what is that percentage, 13%, how do you calculate that? Well, in some sense, you can't really put a number on how did sanctions work, because often the sanctions work by making something not happen, and you never observe that not happening, okay, right? So it brings to my mind the argument that President Obama made back in 2012 when he was contesting the second sort of time he came up for the re-election. And he was accused by the other side of saying, well, you haven't really sort of achieved much. Show us your achievement. And so President Obama said, well, I averted what could have been one of the greatest depressions that the US could have suffered in 100 years through my quick actions. So the quick administration, the quick steps that my administration took, we halted an economic decline that could have been calamitous, almost as bad, if not worse, than the Great Depression. But you can't see that. Okay, it was averted, so nobody saw it. And that's why it's sometimes difficult to put. That's one of the things about deterrence. Deterrence means that you have deterred something from happening, and so you never observe the horrible outcomes that might have occurred. So that's one point you could have latched on to, Isaac, to make your point stronger. That look, in a case, economic sanctions work, but I can't give you numbers because it's mostly the impact is bad things that did not happen. Because of it. So that's one point. You make a good point about punishment. That look, economic sanctions are a substitute for actual war and violence. So they are a non-violent means of trying to achieve your outcomes. And that's a good point because, to the extent that you can avoid war and you can avoid bloodshed, that's a good thing. And so in terms of humanitarian cost effectiveness, it's better to go for economic sanctions than to go for all-out war. Okay? Now, of course, in the case of Ukraine and Russia, we have a funny situation because we see that there are two confounding things that are happening, and they confound the effects. One is that the US and its allies have imposed all these sanctions on Russia. But is that what is sort of preventing Russia from having just gone in and taken over all of Ukraine within 3 days as they had expected? No, that's not all of it, because the Americans and their allies have also poured a lot of military aid into Ukraine, and that is helping the Ukrainians fight a brave battle. Of course, their men and women are fighting this battle too, but they have a lot of equipment support, logistics support from the US and Israel. So, in a sense, we don't quite know which one is working. Is it the economic sanctions that is sort of prolonged this war and prevented Russia from declaring a total win? Or is it all the military aid that has gone? So that's, but that's a good point. I think we could have emphasized that a little bit more, that look, the alternative to economic sanctions, or a lot of economic sanctions, is war and violence, and avoiding that is always a good thing. Okay. I think both of you made good points about unilateral versus multilateral. The fact that, you know, if you are able to get a lot of different countries on your side and you impose a sanction that is binding on the perpetrator, then it might work. But in this case, in the case of Russia, for instance, you don't have that. You have major countries like China, which does not subscribe to the economic sanctions. So the Russians have continued to engage in trade with China. In fact, many developing countries have taken a nuanced stand on the Russian sanctions. India, Brazil, China, all of them have sort of abstained in their UN vote against Russia, and because they need Russian oil, and they sort of accuse the West of complicity, because even European nations have continued to import Russian oil, but the Allies and the United States have asked other countries such as China, Russia, India, Brazil to stop importing Russian oil. So the Brazilians and the Indians say, well, you know, the Europeans continue to purchase Russian oil. How can you stop us from purchasing it? The point about unilateralism, multilateralism is also an important point. How much time do I have, Claudia? Or have you not been keeping my time? I should be subjected to the same rules as everyone else. Okay. Let me wind up. I don't have a lot more to say, but there was one other point I wanted to make, which was about the long-term consequences of these sanctions. And again, I think, Catherine, you would have argued that we have some convincing evidence from Iran, where the US sanctions on all trade with Iran, and those sanctions have been quite punitive, because the US will impose big penalties on third and fourth and fifth nations that trade with Iran. And as a result, it has been very difficult for Iran to import anything, including food, baby formula, infant formula, and all the essentials. So, there are statistics from the United Nations that show that levels of poverty, hunger, malnutrition amongst children have skyrocketed. And so that buttresses your point that it's the ordinary people, often the poorest in the country, who suffer the most. The oligarchs, as you will, have their assets. They are smart. They didn't put all their assets in London or New York. They sort of distributed them all over the world. So they still have their assets that they can tap into in Dubai and Brazil and Mexico and elsewhere. So the rich and the well-connected can somehow evade these sanctions, but it's the poor who bear the brunt of the sanctions. And there's just one final point that I wanted to make, and that is about the long-term effect. So, for instance, Isaac, you could have said that in favor of your point, the US, as you know, about a couple of years back, sanctioned a big Chinese company, the world's largest manufacturer of telecom equipment, Huawei. And they sanctioned them, and by the sanction was that they would not be able to purchase their semiconductor chips from Intel, from American companies. And that was a big blow. It's basically almost crippled that company, which was destined to become the biggest supplier of 5G equipment in the world, and it's one of the largest telecom equipment manufacturer in the world. And it's really crippled that company. So you could have cited that case by saying that, hey, those sanctions worked, okay? But Catherine could have said, well, but what is the long-term effect of those sanctions? Well, what has happened is that those sanctions have made China realize that they can't depend for essential electronic equipment like semiconductor chips, which are highly specialized. They can't depend on the US or on any foreign country for those, because sanctions like this can cripple their economy. And so what have the Chinese started doing? They have started investing, and in another 5 or 10 years, the Chinese will be producing their own semiconductor chips, and so they won't need US semiconductor chips. And so in some sense, you could have argued that the longer you keep these sanctions and the more punitive these actions are, you work against your own long-term interests, because it's not in the long-term interest of the United States to have lost China as an important consumer. Or if the US wanted some future leverage in China, it has lost that, okay? Because 5 years from now, China will be totally self-reliant, and they won't need the US anymore. And that's sort of the reason why sanctions are self-limiting. If you keep them extended for too long, and if you have too many of them, they don't help you either as the nation that sort of inflicted the economic sanctions. But I really like all the points and counterpoints that you made, and the way you answered the questions from the audience, and the way you answered each other's questions. I thought it was very convincing. You came prepared with your research, and I brought up just a few additional points, which I think, would serve you well if you ever did a debate on this again in the future. But at the end of the day, if the debate organizers force me to choose between one or the other team, I have no option to just sort of say both of them are winners, right, Mark? No, okay. So I have to make a choice. I thought I was more convinced by the arguments that Catherine, and so I will judge her the winner of tonight's video. So I said, in a way, Catherine, by selecting herself to be on the pro side, was in the unenviable situation where she could always say, no, but I'm not against economic sanctions. I'm just saying you can't overuse them. Okay. So it's like you were in an untenable situation where you had to defend too many sanctions, unlimited sanctions, forever. And that's a difficult position to defend against. Catherine had the easier job where she could sort of say, no, I never said sanctions are bad. They're good, but they have to be limited in scope. But I think, Catherine, you need to be commended for making your arguments cogently, and you have great presentations. Because I like your style of presentation. Your arguments were short and succinct. Answered questions very well. And Isaac, I thought you brought up some great points. Despite the fact that you were in a slightly untenable situation of defending something that's, too much of anything is never quite defensible. But despite being in that situation, you did a very good job. Okay, so let's give a hand to both of you. Congratulations and congratulations. What next? Alex?
Thank you so much, Dean, for serving as our guest judge today, and congratulations, Catherine, for winning today's debate. Our sincerest thanks again to the Dean for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. And thank you to our student debaters, Catherine Maud, Isaac Inceso, as well as our student debate coaches, Kevin Cromie and Rihanna Tom. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. We hope you'll join us at our next event, June 1st, when UCR School of Public Policy hosts Redland City Council member Denise Davis for a seminar. You can learn more about UCR School of Public Policy events like these by visiting our website, spp.ucr.edu. While you're there, you can also learn about our Master Public Policy program. We're so glad that you can be with us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future SPP events. Until then, goodbye.
To see, and Isaac mentioned that he might be interested in a future graduate career in public policy. Consider yourself enlisted for our Masters of Public Policy program here at UCR.
Thank you.
We would love to have this.
I'm honored.
And maybe we can get you to change your public health mind and get you to be a public policy